The Mafia boss threw the black, Maid against the wall. The entire mansion shuddered. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Tasha Williams had been working in the Castelli mansion for just over 6 months. A quiet woman, she had learned to keep her head down and blend in with the background. Her job was to clean the vast rooms, take care of the kitchen, and deal with the countless guests who passed through the mansion. Most days, she was treated like she was invisible, a mere shadow to the wealthy family that lived there. But she wasn't invisible. She was strong. She had her secrets. She had the quiet strength of a person who had learned to survive, to endure, no matter what life threw at her. Tony Castelli, the Mafia boss who ruled the mansion, was a man who did not like to be challenged. He ran his empire with an iron fist, and the mansion was his fortress. He had always made it clear that his word was law in his house, and no one dared to contradict him. But today was different. Today, Tony was in a bad mood, and Tasha was the unfortunate person who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It all started when Tony walked into the kitchen, furious about a failed business deal. His anger was palpable, and everyone could feel the tension in the air. Tasha, as always, was quietly moving about, trying not to draw attention to herself. But as Tony passed by, his eyes locked onto her, and the anger in his eyes was unmistakable. "You," he snapped, "get out of my way." Tasha didn't flinch. She had heard these kinds of orders before. She stepped aside, but her movement was slow, almost deliberate. It was in that moment that Tony lost control. In a fit of rage, he shoved Tasha against the wall, the force of the impact sending a shock wave through the room. The sound of the collision echoed through the halls of the mansion. The entire house seemed to shudder, as if the walls themselves were reacting to the tension in the air. The room fell silent. The staff who had been busy in the kitchen stopped what they were doing and turned their heads, shocked by what had just happened. But Tasha didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood there, her back against the wall, staring up at Tony with defiance in her eyes. There was no fear in her gaze, only determination. Tony looked down at her, his face red with rage, and for a moment, he saw something in her eyes that made him hesitate. It was something he hadn't seen in anyone in a long time. Something real. Something powerful. But before he could say anything, Tasha straightened up, brushing herself off. "You've made your point," she said quietly, her voice calm, even though her heart was racing. Tony stood frozen, his anger slowly starting to fade as he realized what he had just done. This wasn't just another servant. This was someone who wasn't afraid of him. Someone who wasn't intimidated. And that was something Tony wasn't used to. The silence in the room stretched on, the weight of the moment settling over everyone. It was in that moment that Tony knew something was about to change, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The tension in the mansion was thick. As the staff quietly resumed their duties, no one dared to speak. Tony Castelli stood still, his broad shoulders tense, his hands still gripping the edge of the counter. He had never been challenged like this before. In all his years running the Mafia, he had dealt with countless people who feared him, people who cowered in his presence. But Tasha was different. She didn't flinch when he shoved her. She didn't tremble or beg for mercy. She stood tall, even in the face of his rage. And for some reason, that unsettled him. He had no idea how to react. Tasha, on the other hand, simply turned her back and continued her work, as if nothing had happened. She swept the floor, wiped down the counters, and went about her tasks, never once looking at him again. Her composure left Tony with an uncomfortable feeling that he couldn't shake. He had expected her to apologize, to cower, to show some form of weakness. But she didn't, and that angered him more than anything. He was used to being in control. He was the boss. People feared him. They did what he said. But not her. Not Tasha. The more he watched her, the more he realized that she wasn't afraid of him. She didn't care who he was. She didn't care that he was the boss of the Castelli family. That realization gnawed at him. It made him feel exposed. After a long moment of silence, Tony finally broke the stillness. "I want you to leave," he said, his voice cold and hard. "Pack your things and get out of my house." Tasha didn't respond. She simply nodded, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't argue, didn't try to explain herself. She just continued cleaning, as if his words didn't matter. Tony's eyes narrowed, and his jaw clenched. "I'm not asking," he said, stepping closer to her. "Get out." Still, Tasha didn't look at him. She finished wiping down the counter and then turned, picking up a cloth and moving toward the next task. Tony stood there, watching her, his patience wearing thin. He didn't understand this woman. She was different from everyone else in his life. He had met so many people, powerful people, rich people, all of them desperate to please him, to win his favor. But Tasha wasn't like them. She wasn't trying to please him. She didn't care about his wealth or power. It was like she didn't even notice it. And that infuriated him. "You're not listening to me," Tony said, his voice rising. "I said get out." Finally, Tasha looked up at him. There was no fear in her eyes, no sign of submission. She simply stared at him, her expression calm and unshaken. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice soft but firm. "This is my job. I'm not afraid of you." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Tony didn't know how to respond. His anger surged again, but it was quickly replaced with something else, something deeper. The realization that he couldn't control her the way he controlled everyone else. He was the boss, the one who called the shots, but here, in this moment, he was powerless. Tasha wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't afraid of losing her job. She wasn't afraid of anything. Tony's mind raced. He didn't know how to process it. He had always been in control, always the one who held power over others. But Tasha had turned the tables on him without even trying. He didn't know what to make of her. In the silence that followed, Tasha finally spoke again. "I'm staying. But you can keep trying to push me out if that's what you want," she said, her voice steady and calm. "You won't win." Tony stood there, his thoughts swirling. There was something about her, something he couldn't explain. She wasn't afraid. And that made her powerful. The realization hit him hard, and for the first time in years, Tony felt a flicker of doubt. What if she was right? What if he wasn't the one in control here? Tony stood still, his mind racing as he processed Tasha's words. He had expected her to crumble under his command, to beg for mercy, to apologize. Instead, she stood her ground, calm and composed, defying him in a way no one had ever done before. For the first time, Tony felt a shift in the balance of power. He was the one who usually controlled the room, who made people fear him, but Tasha wasn't afraid. And that realization gnawed at him. He had always been the one in charge, the one with the power, the one who everyone had to listen to. But now, with Tasha, that power seemed meaningless. The more he watched her, the more he realized that she wasn't like the others. She wasn't here to please him or follow his orders. She was here to do her job, and nothing more. And that disturbed him. He tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered, creeping into his thoughts like a shadow that wouldn't go away. For days, Tony couldn't stop thinking about Tasha. Every time he saw her, her calm demeanor and unwavering confidence reminded him of how little control he actually had. She moved around the mansion as if she owned it, her presence undeniable. She was everywhere, in the kitchen, the hallways, the living rooms, and each time, Tony found himself watching her. She was a mystery to him, a puzzle he couldn't solve. But what frustrated him the most was that he couldn't stop thinking about her. One afternoon, Tony found himself standing in the library, staring out the window. The mansion stretched out before him, a symbol of his wealth and power. Yet, in that moment, it felt hollow, empty. The only thing that filled his thoughts was Tasha, her voice, her calmness, her refusal to be intimidated. He had never been the type to dwell on things, to second-guess himself. He was a man of action, a man who took what he wanted. But with Tasha, everything was different. He didn't know what it was about her, but she made him question everything. And that scared him. Tony's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He turned to see one of his assistants, a young man named Marco, standing in the doorway. "Mr. Castelli, there's someone here to see you," Marco said, his voice respectful but nervous. Tony nodded, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. Marco hesitated, then added, It's Tasha, sir. She said it was urgent." Tony froze. Tasha? What could she possibly want? He hadn't expected to see her again so soon, not after their last encounter. But there she was, standing in his office, looking as calm as ever. "Tasha, Tony said, his voice a mix of surprise and curiosity. What is it? Tasha didn't immediately respond. She simply walked into the room, her eyes never leaving his. For a moment, there was silence between them, the air thick with tension. Tony's heart beat a little faster, and he couldn't quite place why. Finally, Tasha spoke. I need to talk to you, she said, her voice steady. Tony raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Go ahead, he said, his curiosity piqued. I've been listening to the rumors, Tasha continued. The rumors about you, about what you've been doing behind closed doors. Tony's expression darkened. He didn't like where this was going. What are you talking about? He asked, his tone sharper now. But Tasha didn't flinch. She just stood there, unwavering, as if she had all the time in the world. I've been working here long enough to know that things aren't as they seem, she said. You've built your empire on lies, on manipulation, on taking from people who can't fight back. Tony took a step forward, anger flaring in his chest. You don't know anything about me, he growled. But Tasha held her ground. I know enough, she said calmly. Enough to know that you're not invincible, that your power is built on something fragile. Tony stared at her, his mind racing. How did she know all of this? How had she figured it out? The thought that someone, especially someone like Tasha, could see through him in a way no one else could, made his blood run cold. Tasha took a step closer, her eyes locked onto his. I don't want anything from you, she said. But I'm not afraid of you anymore. I never was. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Tony didn't know how to respond. He had always been the one who controlled the narrative, who decided who had power and who didn't. But Tasha wasn't playing by his rules. She wasn't afraid of him, and that was a first. A terrifying first. Tasha turned to leave, but just before she reached the door, she paused and glanced back at him. You might be the boss in this mansion, she said softly, but you're not the boss of me. With that, she walked out of the room, leaving Tony standing there, stunned, his mind spinning. As she left, Tony couldn't help but wonder just how much of his power was real, and how much of it was an illusion. And for the first time in years, Tony Castelli, the feared Mafia boss, wasn't sure if he had control anymore. Days passed, but the tension in the mansion lingered like a dark cloud. Tony couldn't shake the feeling that Tasha had gotten under his skin in a way no one ever had. He watched her from a distance, as she went about her work, her movements calm and efficient. There was something about her, something that made him both uneasy and, for reasons he couldn't quite understand, intrigued. The house was quiet, too quiet. For a man like Tony, used to constant noise and chaos, this was a rarity. But the silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a deeper kind of stillness, one that made him question the foundations of everything he had built. Tasha was the center of that stillness. She was the one who had unsettled him, and despite his attempts to ignore it, he couldn't help but think about what she had said. She wasn't afraid of him. She never had been. And that, more than anything, gnawed at him. He had always controlled everything around him, always manipulated people to do his bidding. But Tasha, she wasn't like the others. She didn't bend to his will. It was as if she had her own set of rules, and Tony didn't know how to navigate them. One afternoon, as he walked through the mansion, his mind still heavy with thoughts of Tasha, he overheard a conversation in the hallway. Two of his closest associates, Marco and Vincent, were talking in hushed voices. Tony stopped just out of sight, curiosity getting the better of him. She's not like the others, Marco was saying. She doesn't even blink when Tony gives her an order. It's unsettling. Vincent chuckled softly. You're just overthinking it. She's just a maid, after all. Marco's voice grew quieter, as if he was afraid someone might hear him. No, it's more than that. She's not afraid of Tony. She doesn't back down, no matter how many times he tries to put her in her place. Tony's brow furrowed. He hadn't expected this kind of talk from his men. He had always been the one in control, and hearing his own associates question Tasha's defiance left him feeling exposed. But why? Why did it bother him so much? He had been on top of the world for so long, always one step ahead, always in control. But now, it seemed like Tasha had shaken that balance. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it couldn't continue. He had to do something about it. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Tony sat alone in his office. The mansion was still, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass, but he didn't take a sip. He just stared at it, lost in thought. What was he afraid of? He had built this empire with his own hands. He had risen from nothing to become the most feared man in the city. But now, there was a crack in that foundation. A crack that had appeared in the form of Tasha. He had always prided himself on being a man who could control everything, manipulate anyone, and get what he wanted. But Tasha, she had taken that power away from him. She had made him question himself in a way no one else ever had. His mind raced, but he couldn't find an answer. He had never felt this way before, so unsure, so vulnerable. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't let this go on. He couldn't let someone like Tasha challenge him. But as he stood up and paced the room, a nagging voice in the back of his mind told him that maybe, just maybe, he was looking at the situation all wrong. Maybe it wasn't about control. Maybe it was about something deeper, something he had forgotten along the way. The next morning, Tony found himself standing outside the kitchen, watching Tasha as she prepared breakfast for the family. She moved with an effortless grace, as if nothing in the world could disturb her peace. For a moment, he considered going in, confronting her, asserting his authority. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the calmness in her demeanor, the way she didn't need anyone's approval, the way she simply existed in the space she had carved out for herself. He didn't understand it, but he admired it. As Tony stood there, lost in his thoughts, Tasha looked up, catching his gaze for the briefest of moments. She didn't say anything, but there was a knowing look in her eyes, as if she could read him like an open book. It made Tony uneasy, but it also made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, she had something to teach him. The days following that morning seemed to drag on for Tony. Every time he thought about the brief exchange with Tasha, he felt an unsettling weight in his chest. He had never been the type to dwell on things. His mind was always sharp, always calculating, always in control. But with her, it was different. Tasha's presence in the mansion, in his life, had become a constant reminder that things were slipping out of his grasp. It wasn't just the way she moved around the house with such confidence. It was the way she looked at him, like she could see through him, like she could read his every thought. And that made Tony uncomfortable. He had spent years building his empire, his reputation. He had carefully crafted every aspect of his life to project power and authority. But now, one woman had the ability to make him question everything he had built. And that was something Tony couldn't allow. His thoughts were interrupted one morning when he found himself once again standing in the kitchen, watching Tasha as she prepared breakfast. He had become a regular visitor, not out of necessity, but out of a strange sense of curiosity. She moved with the same quiet efficiency as always, her hands working with precision as she set the table, stirred the pots, and cleaned the counters. It was almost as if she was in her own world, untouched by the chaos that often surrounded him. Tony cleared his throat, stepping into the room, and Tasha glanced up. She didn't flinch or look away. Her eyes met his, steady and calm. "Tony," she said, her voice as soft as ever. "What can I do for you this morning?" Her words were simple, but they carried a weight he couldn't ignore. It was like she had control over the situation without even trying. Tony hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by the directness of her question. He had expected her to act submissive, to be at his mercy. But instead, she was the one in control. "I was just wondering how you're doing," he said, surprised at how awkward his own voice sounded. Tasha paused for a moment, then smiled lightly. "I'm doing fine, Tony. Just the usual work around here. Nothing too difficult." There was something in her tone, something so effortlessly confident, that made Tony's chest tighten. He wanted to say something, anything, to regain control of the conversation, but the words didn't come. He had never felt this uncertain before. "You seem comfortable here," he said, trying to steer the conversation back to a safer ground. "More than most people would be." Tasha shrugged, her expression unreadable. "I've always found a way to make myself comfortable, no matter where I am," she replied, her tone matter of fact. "In this place, it's just a job, a roof over my head." Tony didn't know why, but her words made him feel small. He had never thought of his mansion, his empire, as just a job. It was a symbol of his power, his success. And yet, here was Tasha, standing in his kitchen, speaking as if it was nothing more than a means to an end. A job. It shook him to his core. "So that's all this is for? You?" Tony asked, his voice softer now, almost as if he were trying to understand her. "A roof over your head." Tasha met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. Yes, she said. And a paycheck. Tony stood there for a moment, processing her words. It was as if she had stripped away all the layers of grandeur, all the illusions he had built around his life, and laid everything bare. He had always prided himself on the life he had created, but now, standing in front of Tasha, it all seemed empty. I've spent my life building this, Tony said, his voice tinged with frustration. This mansion, this family, this empire. And you just see it as a roof over your head. Tasha's gaze softened, and for the first time, she took a step toward him. Tony, it's not about what you've built. It's about what you've lost along the way, she said quietly. You've spent so much time building your empire that you've forgotten what really matters. And that's why it feels empty. You've forgotten how to live. Her words hit him harder than any blow he had ever received. It wasn't just her defiance that unsettled him. It was the truth behind it. He had spent so many years chasing power, wealth, control. But in the process, he had lost sight of what really mattered. Human connection, love, trust. He had built an empire, yes, but at what cost? Tasha looked at him one last time, then turned back to the stove, continuing her work without a second glance. Tony stood there for a long time, his mind swirling with the implications of her words. He didn't know how to fix it, how to make things right. But he knew one thing for sure. Tasha had changed something inside him. And whether he wanted to admit it or not, it was something he couldn't ignore. Tony spent the following days in a kind of haze. He couldn't shake the conversation he had with Tasha in the kitchen. Her words echoed in his mind, lingering like a shadow he couldn't escape. He had always been a man of action, a man who never doubted himself. But now, he found himself questioning everything he had ever known. He had spent so much of his life building his empire, creating something that everyone feared and respected. Yet, standing in front of Tasha, he had felt like a stranger in his own life. The mansion, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a cage. Every time he walked through the hallways, every room he entered, it seemed empty. The walls no longer whispered of success. They whispered of something else, something missing, something that had been lost along the way. For the first time in years, Tony felt a strange sense of isolation. He had everything a man could want: money, power, influence. But none of it seemed to matter anymore. He realized that he had spent so much time controlling everything around him that he had forgotten how to truly live. The days began to blur together as Tony drifted through his routine. He still held meetings, still managed his business, still kept up the facade of the powerful Mafia boss. But inside, he felt hollow. He couldn't focus. He couldn't think straight. The only thing that seemed to matter was the nagging thought of Tasha. It wasn't just her defiance that unsettled him. It was the way she made him feel. It was like she had exposed a part of him that he had buried deep inside. A part of him he didn't even know was there. Her words haunted him. You've forgotten how to live. Every time he saw her, every time he heard her voice, it was as if she was reminding him of something he had lost. One afternoon, Tony found himself standing by the window in his office, looking out at the sprawling city below. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the skyline, but he hardly noticed. His mind was elsewhere, lost in thought. He had built everything with his own hands, but now it all felt so fragile. It was as if one small crack could bring everything crashing down. He turned away from the window and walked toward the door, his steps heavy. As he passed through the hallway, he saw Tasha again, this time in the living room, arranging flowers. She looked up and met his gaze, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. No words were spoken, but it felt like everything had been said. Tony paused for a moment, just watching her. She had this calmness about her, this peace, as if nothing in the world could disturb her. It was something he had never known. He envied it. Tasha, Tony said, his voice surprisingly steady. She turned to face him, her expression neutral. What is it, Tony? She asked, her voice soft but firm. He hesitated. There was something he wanted to say, something he needed to say, but the words caught in his throat. I've been thinking, he began, his voice trailing off. Tasha didn't respond, but she didn't need to. She just waited, her gaze steady, patient. Tony swallowed hard, trying to gather his thoughts. I've spent so much time focusing on power, on control, he said slowly, his voice filled with frustration. I thought that was all that mattered. But now, I see it's not enough. Tasha didn't say anything for a long time, just continued with her task, her movements calm and deliberate. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes soft. "You're not the only one who's lost something," she said quietly. "We all lose things along the way. It's how we choose to move forward that matters." Her words hit Tony like a punch to the gut. He had never thought of it that way. He had spent so much of his life trying to control everything, trying to hold on to power, that he had lost sight of what really mattered. Tasha was right. It wasn't about control. It was about connection. It was about being human. Tony stood there, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he was beginning to understand something he had always ignored. But it wasn't enough to just understand. He had to change. He had to make things right. He had to start living again. "I don't know what to do," Tony admitted, his voice low. "I've made so many mistakes." Tasha finally stopped what she was doing and looked at him. There was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding. "We all make mistakes," she said softly. "But it's never too late to start over. It's never too late to change." For the first time in a long while, Tony felt something stir inside him, something that felt like hope. It wasn't going to be easy. He knew that. But he was ready to try. Ready to face the changes he had been avoiding for so long. He was ready to stop hiding behind his power, behind his walls. Ready to start living again. And somehow, he knew, it was all going to start with Tasha. The days after that conversation with Tasha felt strangely different for Tony. He had been used to waking up every day in a world that revolved around him, a world where power, wealth, and control were the only things that mattered. But now, after facing the truth in Tasha's words, the mansion no longer felt like his fortress. It felt like a prison. He spent his days thinking, reflecting, and questioning everything he had ever believed about himself. The once grand halls that had echoed with his commands now felt hollow, as if the walls were whispering of regrets, of choices that could never be undone. Tasha, on the other hand, went about her work with the same calm demeanor, the same unwavering composure. She didn't know the full extent of the changes Tony was going through, but she could feel it in the air. There was something different about him, something that had shifted. He no longer carried himself with the same arrogance, the same sense of entitlement. He seemed humbled, but Tony hadn't spoken much to her since their last encounter. He had kept his distance, unsure of how to proceed. He didn't know if he could change, if he could let go of the man he had been for so many years. But deep down, he knew he had to try. One afternoon, Tony found himself standing at the back of the mansion, looking out at the gardens. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the lawn. It was a beautiful day, peaceful in a way Tony had forgotten was possible. He felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet realization settling in his chest. He wasn't the man he used to be, and for the first time, that didn't scare him. As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, Tasha walked by, carrying a basket of laundry. She didn't notice him at first, but as she passed, she looked up, catching his gaze. There was a moment of silence, a moment where everything seemed to pause. For a second, Tony almost felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. She nodded, as if acknowledging him without saying a word, and he returned the gesture. It was a small thing, but it meant more to him than he could express. He realized then that it wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic changes. It was about the small moments, the quiet understanding between two people. Maybe he didn't have to fix everything all at once. Maybe it was enough to start with something simple, like a change in how he saw the world around him. Later that evening, Tony found himself sitting at his desk, staring at the paperwork in front of him. He had spent the past few days sorting through his finances, his empire, his plans for the future. But tonight, he couldn't focus on any of it. His mind kept drifting back to Tasha, to the way she had looked at him earlier, to the quiet strength she seemed to carry with her. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of clarity. He didn't need to control everything. He didn't need to be the one who always had the last word. There was a different kind of power, a quieter power, that he could embrace. As he sat there, thinking, there was a knock at the door. It was Tasha. She stepped into the room without hesitation, her expression as calm as ever. "Tony," she said softly, "there's a meeting tomorrow morning. You'll need to prepare." Tony looked up at her, surprised by the simplicity of her words. He had expected some kind of formality, some kind of distance between them. But there was none. There was no fear in her voice, no sense of inferiority. She was just herself. And for some reason, That made Tony feel more at ease than he had in a long time. "Thank you, Tasha," Tony said, his voice sincere. "I'll be ready." She nodded and turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "You don't have to do everything alone, you know," she said quietly, almost as if she was offering him a small piece of advice, something she had learned from her own life. Tony sat back in his chair, staring at the door long after she had left. Her words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, he felt like maybe he wasn't alone in this. Maybe, just maybe, he could start to rebuild not just his empire, but himself. As the days went on, Tony began to change in ways he hadn't expected. He spent more time listening, more time reflecting on his choices, and less time focusing on power. He started to trust others, to delegate, to give up the control he had held so tightly for so long. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when he slipped back into old habits, but with each passing day, he felt a little lighter, a little freer. And all the while, Tasha remained a quiet presence in his life, never pushing, never demanding, just being there, offering him a kind of peace he had never known. He still didn't fully understand her, but he was beginning to appreciate her in a way he hadn't before. She had shown him that true strength wasn't about domination. It was about acceptance, understanding, and growth. And for the first time in a long while, Tony felt like he was starting to become the man he was always meant to be. Tony sat in his office late into the night, the city lights outside flickering like distant stars. His mind, usually filled with plans and schemes, was quiet now. For the first time in years, he wasn't consumed by thoughts of power or control. Instead, he found himself reflecting on everything that had changed since he had met Tasha. The house, the empire, the relationships, all of it had once seemed so certain, so solid. But now, it all felt different. Tasha had opened his eyes to something he had never allowed himself to see: the emptiness of his pursuits. The desire for dominance, the hunger for more, they had all led him to a life that lacked the one thing he truly needed: connection. It wasn't something he had ever consciously missed, but now, it was all he could think about. He glanced down at the paperwork in front of him, the contracts, the numbers, all of it meaningless now. The wealth and power he had spent years accumulating seemed like an illusion. The real value, the real purpose, was something deeper, something he had been too blind to recognize until now. Tony leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts drifted to Tasha. She had always been there, a quiet presence in his life. She had never asked for anything, never demanded attention. But she had given him something priceless: perspective. She had shown him that there was more to life than control, more to happiness than what he had thought would bring it. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to see Tasha standing in the doorway, her expression as calm as always. She didn't say anything, just looked at him for a moment, as if waiting for him to speak first. "Tasha," Tony said, his voice soft. "I've been thinking about what you said, about what really matters." Tasha didn't respond, but she stepped into the room and took a seat across from him. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond that had formed over the past few weeks, though neither of them had spoken of it. Tasha simply waited, letting him find the words he needed. "I've spent my whole life building something that I thought would bring me happiness," Tony continued, his voice steady but filled with regret. "But all I've done is build walls around myself, walls that kept me from seeing what really matters." Tasha's gaze softened, and she nodded. She didn't need to say anything. Tony knew she understood. "I've hurt people," Tony said, his voice breaking slightly. "I've used people. And for what? Power? Control? It never felt like enough." Tasha remained silent, her presence a steady anchor. "I can't change what I've done," Tony said, the weight of his past pressing heavily on him. "But I can start doing better. I can start living differently." For the first time in a long time, Tony felt a sense of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know exactly what his future would look like. But he knew one thing for sure. He didn't want to keep living the way he had been. He didn't want to keep hiding behind his wealth and his empire. He wanted to change, to grow, to connect with others in a way he never had before. He wanted to be a better person. "You've taught me something important, Tasha," Tony said, looking at her with gratitude. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for all the things I've done, but I can start by being honest with myself and with others." Tasha didn't respond immediately, but her eyes held a depth of understanding that made Tony feel seen in a way he never had before. He had always been a man of action, of words, but with Tasha, he realized that sometimes silence spoke louder than anything else. As the evening wore on, Tony and Tasha sat in silence, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. For Tony, it was a moment of clarity, a moment where he finally understood that true power wasn't about domination or control. It was about connection, about building trust, about being true to oneself. It was about finding peace in the quiet moments, the moments when the world slowed down enough for him to see what truly mattered. And as the night grew darker, Tony felt a small spark of hope ignite within him. It was a hope he hadn't felt in years, a hope that maybe, just maybe, he could start over. A hope that, with Tasha's quiet guidance, he could find a way to rebuild not just his life, but his soul. The following weeks were a strange mix of discomfort and change for Tony. Every day felt like a step into unknown territory, as if he were relearning how to live. He had always thrived on routine, on the predictable chaos of his world. But now, there was a quiet that seemed to follow him, especially when he was near Tasha. She was everywhere and nowhere at once, a constant presence that he couldn't seem to shake, but one that also gave him a sense of calm he had never known. It was unsettling, yet comforting. He started waking up earlier, making an effort to step outside his office and engage with the world around him. He spoke with his associates more openly, listening instead of dominating the conversation. He even found himself going through the mansion, examining the details that once would have seemed insignificant to him. What had once been just an object, a symbol of his power, now had meaning. Every painting, every piece of furniture, every quiet corner of the estate seemed to tell a story. But the most telling story was the one that had begun to unfold between him and Tasha. She was not someone who sought his approval, nor did she seem to care for his status. And yet, she was the one who had brought him to this point. Slowly, Tony began to see the mansion and his empire in a new light. He wasn't sure if he could fix all the broken pieces of his life, but he knew that it had to start with something as simple as change. It wasn't going to be easy. The weight of his past, the things he had done to build his empire, hung over him like a shadow. There were still moments when he felt the familiar itch for power, when his old instincts tried to rise up. But then he would think of Tasha, of the way she had stood up to him, and it would remind him that there was another way to live. There was a moment one morning, just after breakfast, when Tony decided to step outside and walk through the garden. He hadn't taken a walk through the grounds in years. The mansion, the sprawling estate, had always been a place to hide, not a place to be present. But now, with Tasha's quiet influence, he found himself wanting to connect with the world around him, to embrace the simple act of living. As he walked, he found himself thinking about the choices he had made, the people he had hurt. He had been so focused on the future, on building something bigger, that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. But what could he do now? Could he change his ways? Could he rebuild the trust that he had destroyed? He didn't know, but the first step was admitting it. He had never been one to apologize, never been one to show vulnerability. But lately, he had felt the need to make amends, to try and undo some of the damage he had done. It was something small, something he had never considered before, the idea of acknowledging the past and moving forward. Later that day, Tony sat in his office, looking over the business documents. His fingers drummed lightly on the desk, a nervous habit he hadn't had in years. He felt an unfamiliar sense of anxiety. What if he couldn't make things right? What if, in trying to change, he lost everything? His eyes drifted to the window, and he saw Tasha walking across the courtyard, carrying a basket of freshly picked flowers. She looked so calm, so assured, as if she had no doubts about anything. It was a stark contrast to the chaos inside Tony's mind. He envied that calm. He envied the way she moved through the world with such ease. Tony leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had never been one to admit weakness, but today, the weight of everything seemed unbearable. He didn't know how to fix what he had broken. He didn't know if he could, but he knew one thing. He had to try. It was all he had left. The sound of a knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He straightened up quickly, trying to regain his composure. "Come in," he called out. Tasha stepped into the room, her expression as calm as always. "I've been thinking," Tony said, his voice uncertain. "About everything." About the way I've lived my life. I've spent so long focused on building this empire, on controlling everything around me, that I forgot what really matters. Tasha listened, her gaze steady. There was no judgment in her eyes, only quiet understanding. Tony continued, his words slow but sincere. I can't undo everything I've done, he said, but I want to do better. I want to change, and I need your help. Tasha nodded slowly, her expression softening. She didn't say anything at first, but her silence spoke volumes. Tony felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this. Tasha didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to offer solutions. Her presence, her quiet support, was enough. She understood, and somehow, that was the reassurance Tony needed. Maybe, just maybe, he could change. He wasn't sure where the road ahead would lead, but for the first time, he was ready to find out. The days that followed Tony's conversation with Tasha felt like the beginning of something new, yet the uncertainty never truly left him. He had made the decision to change, to step away from the man he had been for so long, but the path ahead still felt unclear. For years, he had defined himself by power, by control, by building an empire that no one could touch. But now, in the silence of his office, in the stillness of his home, he realized that none of that had brought him the peace he had longed for. The mansion was no longer a symbol of victory. It was a reminder of all the things he had lost along the way. As he walked through the halls, Tony couldn't help but feel the weight of his past mistakes pressing down on him. It wasn't just the business dealings, the harsh decisions, or the people he had hurt. It was the years of isolation, the years spent building walls around himself, that left him feeling like a stranger in his own life. He had kept people at a distance, refusing to let anyone get close, afraid that if they did, they would see the cracks in the carefully constructed persona he had created. But now, with Tasha, he had to confront those cracks. She had seen through him in ways no one else ever had. And in doing so, she had made him realize that the life he had been living wasn't enough. It wasn't even close. One evening, after a long day of meetings and business calls, Tony sat by the fire in his study, staring into the flickering flames. His thoughts were still consumed with the idea of change, with the uncertainty of what it would take to rebuild his life. It seemed like an impossible task, a mountain too high to climb. But as he sat there, the quiet of the mansion surrounding him, a thought began to take root in his mind. Maybe the climb didn't have to be so steep. Maybe it was about taking small steps, one at a time, instead of trying to fix everything at once. The realization brought a sense of peace he hadn't expected. Change, he realized, didn't happen overnight. It was a process, a series of moments and choices that slowly added up to something greater. The next morning, Tony made a decision. He had a meeting scheduled with several of his associates, but instead of rushing in with his usual authority, he chose to approach it differently. He walked into the meeting room with a calm demeanor, his posture relaxed, his mind open. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to dominate the conversation. He simply listened. As the meeting progressed, Tony found himself genuinely interested in the ideas and opinions of his team. He didn't interrupt or try to steer the discussion in his favor. Instead, he let others speak, let them share their thoughts without fear of being shut down. It was a small shift, but it was a shift nonetheless. By the end of the meeting, Tony felt a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't the kind of accomplishment he had been used to, the feeling of victory after a deal was made or a plan was executed. No, this was different. It was the satisfaction of knowing that he had allowed others to contribute, that he had given them a voice. That evening, after the meeting, Tony sat down at his desk, reflecting on the changes he had made so far. It wasn't easy. There were moments when he felt his old instincts rising up, moments when he wanted to take control, to assert his power. But each time he resisted. He was learning that power wasn't about control. It was about influence. It was about leading with integrity, about earning respect through actions, not fear. As he looked out the window at the city below, Tony realized that he still had a long way to go. There were challenges ahead, people who would test him, tempt him to return to his old ways. But for the first time in his life, he felt ready. He felt capable of facing whatever came his way. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to see Tasha standing in the doorway. "I heard the meeting went well," she said, her voice calm but warm. Tony smiled, a genuine smile. the kind he hadn't worn in years. It did, he replied. I think I'm finally starting to get it. Tasha stepped into the room and took a seat across from him. You're doing well, she said softly. You're not the man you were before. But remember, change isn't a destination. It's a journey. Tony nodded, absorbing her words. For the first time, he understood what she meant. He didn't have to have all the answers. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. Thank you, Tasha, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. For everything. Tasha smiled, but there was no need for further words. She had already given him everything he needed. With that, she stood up and left the room, leaving Tony to reflect on how far he had come and how far he still had to go. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of the journey ahead. He was ready to face it, no matter where it led. Tony's life had taken a drastic turn, and he felt as though the walls of his once impenetrable empire had begun to crumble. The months following his decision to change had not been without struggle, but they had been filled with progress. The mansion, once a symbol of his unchecked power, now felt like a reminder of everything he had fought to leave behind. As he walked through its halls, he no longer felt the weight of dominance, but the weight of reflection. He was beginning to see his life not through the lens of conquest, but through the lens of the relationships he had neglected, the moments he had ignored. And at the center of it all was Tasha. It was a strange thing, to be in the presence of someone who made you face the uncomfortable truths about yourself. He had spent so many years crafting an image of strength, of authority, and yet here was Tasha, without any effort, showing him that true strength didn't lie in control. She had quietly dismantled everything he had once believed to be true about himself. The shift wasn't easy, and Tony knew that. There were days when the old habits crept back in, when his desire for power surged, when he wanted to take back control. But each time, he remembered Tasha's calm words, the way she had stood up to him when no one else would, and he resisted. Change, he realized, wasn't about avoiding the old parts of himself. It was about understanding them and choosing to act differently. One afternoon, as Tony sat at his desk, going over the plans for the next phase of his business, he felt a strange sense of clarity. He was no longer driven by the need to prove himself to anyone. He wasn't trying to impress his associates or maintain an image of invincibility. For the first time, he was working for himself. He was working to build something that mattered, something that had meaning beyond money and power. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Marco, one of his closest associates. Tony hadn't heard from him in a while, and a small part of him felt unease at the sudden contact. He opened the message, and it was a simple request. We need to talk. Can you meet me tomorrow? Tony stared at the message for a moment. His instincts told him something was off, but his newfound perspective urged him not to jump to conclusions. He replied, I'll meet you at the office. That evening, Tony found himself walking through the quiet mansion, reflecting on the changes that had taken place. The walls no longer felt like they were closing in on him. There was a sense of freedom, of possibility, that he hadn't felt in years. As he passed the living room, he saw Tasha sitting by the window, looking out at the night sky. She was so still, so composed, and for a moment, Tony thought about how far he had come. Tasha, he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. She turned to look at him, her eyes meeting his with that same quiet understanding. Everything okay? She asked. Tony nodded, though the weight of the upcoming meeting with Marco still lingered in his mind. Just thinking, he replied, about everything that's changed. Tasha smiled slightly, the corners of her mouth lifting just enough to convey warmth. Change isn't easy, she said, but it's always worth it. Tony watched her for a moment, a deep sense of gratitude swelling in his chest. You've taught me more than I ever expected to learn, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Tasha looked at him, her gaze unwavering. You're the one who chose to change, she replied. I just helped you see it. The sincerity in her words hit Tony harder than he expected. He realized that, for the first time, he wasn't just grateful for what she had taught him. He was grateful for the person he was becoming because of her influence. The next day, Tony met Marco at his office. The tension in the room was palpable as Marco sat across from him, his expression unreadable. What's this about? Tony asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Marco shifted in his seat, his eyes avoiding Tony's for a moment before locking with his. There's something you need to know, Tony, Marco began, his voice low. There's been talk. Talk about you. About the changes you've been making. Tony raised an eyebrow, his instincts immediately on alert. What kind of talk? He asked. Marco hesitated, then continued. Some of the men are concerned. They think you're losing your edge. They think you've softened. Tony's heart skipped a beat. He had expected some resistance, but hearing it from Marco, someone he had trusted for years, stung. I'm not losing my edge, Tony said firmly, his voice steady. I'm choosing a different path. Marco looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Tony, I respect you, he said finally. But you need to understand that the world doesn't change because you want it to. People respect strength, and right now, they see you as weak. Tony leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had expected this, but hearing it out loud, from someone so close to him, made it feel real. I'm not weak, Tony said, his voice quiet but unwavering. I'm stronger than I've ever been. Marco studied him for a moment longer before standing up. I hope you're right, he said quietly. As Marco left the room, Tony sat in silence, the weight of his choices settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would always be people who doubted him, people who would try to pull him back into his old ways. But Tony had made his decision. He was no longer the man he once was. He was ready to lead in a different way, a way that mattered, a way that respected others, and, most importantly, respected himself. Tony sat alone in his office, the room silent except for the soft hum of the city outside. The weight of Marco's words still hung in the air, a reminder of the tension that lingered beneath the surface. The doubts, the questions, the fears, he had always known they were there, but hearing them from someone he trusted so deeply made them feel more real, more immediate. For years, he had relied on his strength, his authority, to keep everyone and everything in its place. But now, as he stared at the papers on his desk, he realized that wasn't enough anymore. He had made the choice to change, to redefine what it meant to lead, but the journey was never going to be easy. It was going to require more than just the decision to do better. It would require strength of a different kind, one that didn't rely on power and control, but on something deeper, something he wasn't sure he had in him. The door creaked open, and Tasha stepped inside. She didn't say anything at first, but her presence was enough to shift the atmosphere in the room. She had always had that effect on him. Calm, grounded, unwavering. She was a reminder of everything he had been trying to understand. You're quiet today, Tasha said softly, her voice breaking the silence. Tony didn't immediately respond. He wanted to tell her what was on his mind, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. For a moment, he simply looked at her, as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. Finally, he spoke. Marco came to see me today, he said, his voice low. He's worried. He thinks I'm losing my edge. He thinks I've softened. Tasha raised an eyebrow, her expression thoughtful. And what do you think? She asked. Tony leaned back in his chair, his fingers running through his hair. I don't know, he admitted. Part of me wants to believe he's wrong, that I'm doing the right thing, that I'm changing in a way that matters. But then there's this part of me that wonders if I've made a mistake, if I've lost something that I can't get back. Tasha walked over to his desk and stood beside him, her gaze steady and unwavering. Change isn't about losing something, she said quietly. It's about gaining something new. It's about finding a different way to be, to lead, to connect with people. You're not losing your edge. You're just finding a new one. Tony looked at her, her words sinking in deeper than he expected. It was exactly what he needed to hear. He had been so focused on the fear of losing himself, of becoming someone he didn't recognize, that he had overlooked the possibility that change wasn't about losing at all. It was about growth. It was about evolving into something better. Tasha smiled slightly, sensing the shift in his demeanor. You've always had the strength to change, Tony, she said. You just had to see it for yourself. Tony nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He knew she was right. He had always been capable of more than he had allowed himself to believe. But the fear, the doubt, the constant need for control, it had all held him back. Now, for the first time, he could see the way forward. It wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't going to be perfect, but he was ready to try. I've been afraid, Tony admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Afraid of what I'd become if I let go of the control. Afraid that I wouldn't be strong anymore. Tasha placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch steady and reassuring. You've always been strong, she said, But strength doesn't always mean control. It means knowing when to let go, when to trust others, when to listen. Tony looked at her, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. For so long, he had seen strength as something that came from domination, from power. But now he understood. True strength came from vulnerability, from the willingness to change, from the courage to face the unknown. And for the first time in his life, Tony felt like he was ready to embrace that kind of strength. As the days passed, Tony continued to challenge himself, to lean into the changes that were unfolding within him. He spent more time listening to his team, giving them space to contribute, to offer their ideas. He made an effort to build connections, not just as a boss, but as a person who genuinely cared about the people around him. And the more he did, the more he realized that the power he had once relied on so heavily wasn't the answer to everything. It was the relationships, the trust, the respect that made all the difference. He had been afraid of losing control, but now, he understood that true power wasn't in control at all. It was in the ability to let go, to trust, to build something meaningful with the people around him. And as he walked through the mansion, the halls no longer felt empty. They felt full of possibility, full of change, full of life. Tony knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the journey. He was ready to face whatever came next, because he wasn't facing it alone anymore. He had found something he had never had before: connection. The days felt lighter now, though Tony knew that the real work had only just begun. He had made the decision to change, but every day still brought new challenges, new tests. As he walked through the mansion, everything seemed different, yet the same. The grand chandeliers still hung above him. The polished marble floors still reflected his every step, but now they seemed less like markers of wealth and power, and more like markers of the journey he had taken. He was beginning to look at his world through new eyes, through eyes that saw more than just what was in front of him. Tony had always relied on his instincts, his sharp mind, his ability to control everything around him. But now, he was learning to rely on something else: his heart. He had begun to trust in others more, to lean into the relationships he had spent so long avoiding. And, strangely, it was working. The business was still thriving. The empire he had spent years building was still in place. But now, he led it with a sense of purpose, not just power. The shift in his approach had rippled through the people around him. Associates, once fearful of his wrath, now seemed more willing to engage with him, to offer their own insights and opinions. They no longer feared him, but respected him, and that made all the difference. But there were still moments, fleeting though they were, when Tony found himself slipping back into old habits. The desire to control, the need to dominate, would surface, and for a brief moment, he would feel that familiar urge to make the world bend to his will. But each time, he remembered what Tasha had taught him. Each time, he stopped himself. He couldn't live that way anymore. And so, he kept moving forward, one step at a time. The mansion no longer felt like a prison, but a home. The people who lived in it, the ones who worked in it, had all become part of his journey. And as he walked through the halls now, he wasn't just a man of power. He was a man of understanding. Tasha was always there, a quiet presence, steady and sure. Tony often found himself seeking her out, just to be in her presence, to talk with her, to listen. She never pushed him, never demanded anything from him. She simply was. And that was enough. She had become not just a part of his life, but a part of the change he was undergoing. She was his anchor, his reminder that the best things in life were the ones you couldn't control. One evening, as the sun began to set and the mansion was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Tony found himself sitting outside, looking over the gardens. He had spent so much time in the past looking at his empire through the lens of control and success, but now, he saw it as a tapestry of moments, of relationships, of people who had helped shape him, even if he hadn't known it at the time. Tasha joined him outside, as she often did, and sat down beside him. For a moment, they simply sat in silence, both watching the sunset. The world around them seemed to slow, as if the universe itself was giving them space to breathe. "You've changed," Tasha said softly, her voice breaking the silence. Tony turned to look at her, surprised by the simplicity of the statement. "I don't feel like I have," he said quietly. "I'm still the same person." Tasha smiled, her gaze gentle. "No, you're not. The old you was all about control. The new you," She paused, her eyes meeting his. The new you is learning to let go. And that's a big change. Tony's heart skipped a beat. He had always been so focused on power, on maintaining control. But here, in this moment, with Tasha beside him, he realized she was right. He had changed. Maybe not in the ways he had expected, and maybe not in ways that others could see, but he had changed. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. I'm still learning, Tony said, his voice thick with emotion. I still don't have all the answers. Tasha looked at him with that same steady gaze. You don't need all the answers, she said. You just need to keep moving forward. That's all anyone can do. Tony nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. He had spent so much time trying to have everything figured out, trying to control every outcome. But now he realized it wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being open to the possibilities, to the moments that came along the way. As the night settled in, Tony and Tasha remained outside, watching the stars appear one by one in the clear sky above. The mansion, the empire, the wealth, none of it mattered in that moment. What mattered was the peace they shared, the quiet understanding that had grown between them. And for Tony, that was enough. He had spent years chasing something that had never truly brought him happiness. But now, he was learning to appreciate the simple things, the moments, the people, the connections that made life worth living. He wasn't sure where the road ahead would take him, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the journey. With Tasha by his side, he knew he was ready for whatever came next.